Georgia. Thanks to the organizers for having me, and thank you all for being here. This is joint work with Bjorn Bray, a student from Nottingham, who is on the market this year. It is well known that colonial empires boosted trade between the mother country and the colonies, inducing the colonies to specialize in primary products. And of course, there were big gains associated with that specialization. However, according to some people, colonial trade also had a darker side. In particular, it has been argued that trade hindered industrialization in the colonies and helped them to keep them subjugated by making them more specialized and hence economically dependent on the mother country. In this paper, we attempt to investigate those claims in the context of colonial India and using the exogenous interruption to colonial trade due to World War I. The blue line on the left is real imports from Britain, which were mostly manufactures, while the blue line on the right is real exports to Britain, which were mostly primary products. World War I had a clear effect on imports of manufactures, which collapsed, while the effect on exports of primary products was more mixed because some boomed while others collapsed. The collapse in imports was plausibly due to a supply shock in Britain. It used to produce for world markets, and now it turned to producing for the war effort, and to an increase in trade costs. So what we do is to construct a district-level measure of exposure to the World War I trade shock and ask two questions. First, did more exposed districts industrialize faster? And here we think it is very important to ask if any effect was long-lasting, because that's the first attempt at discriminating between a static model of trade and specialization from a dynamic model. In a static model, you would expect the effect of a temporary interruption in trade to reverse itself after the interruption was over. In a dynamic model, however, such as the infant industry model, the effect could be long-lasting. The second question we're going to ask is, did more industrialized districts, which were those that had moved further away from the specialization induced by colonial trade, lend greater support to the anti-colonial movement? And here we will address the problem that industrialization levels are endogenous, using the World War I trade shock as an instrument. What we find is that the World War I trade shock had a positive and persistent level effect on industrialization, on industry, which was still visible in 2011. The size of the effect was not small. It accounted for between 29 and 40% of industrial employment growth between 1911 and 1921. And we find some evidence that the effect was due to learning. We also find that more industrialized districts displayed stronger anti-colonial feelings in a 1922 survey, and that they lent greater support to the Indian National Congress, from now INC, in the landmark election of 1937. I'll skip over the related literature and historical background, but of course I can answer specific questions if there are any. Going to the empirical approach then, in our first part, we regress change in the industrial employment share in District N between 1911 and 1921 on a measure of exposure to the World War I trade shock. We initially look at the shock to net Indian exports to the UK, that is exports minus imports, but we later decompose the shock into its component parts. The shock is constructed in the usual way. Since we only observe national trade flows or trade flows at the national level, we attribute the shock, the national shock, to any industry I differently across districts, depending on their initial specialization in industry I. And we then sum across industries. In the second part of the paper, where we study the impact of industrialization levels on anti-colonial feelings, we regress measures of anti-colonial feelings in District N and at 2 points in time after World War I on contemporary industrialization levels, but instrumenting for industrialization levels using the World War I trade shock. As I said, we have two measures of anti-colonial feelings, which refer to critical junctures in the history of the anti-colonial movement. The first is a survey that was run in 1922. This was the year in which Gandhi's first mass protest failed. In the aftermath, the INC ran an internal survey asking party members how strongly they felt in favor of immediate civil disobedience. Anti-colonial here will be a district-level measure of the average response of INC members in District 10. The second measure is the share of seats won by the INC in the landmark 1937 election. This was the first election which the INC contested and which brought it into power for the first time. Anti-colonial here is the share of seats won by the INC in constituency J in District N. And constituencies were almost always subsets of districts. On the data collection, we collected product-level trade data between India and Britain, and between India and selected third countries, and between Britain and selected trade countries, and industrial employment data at the district sector level. For industrial employment, we have manufacturing, but also the industrial processing of primary products, such as flour or gin cotton or iron ore. Tea and rubber plantations are also classified as industry in the Indian census and are included here. And as usual, we had to match the trade and industrial data by hand, since they use different nomenclatures. Okay, coming to the results, our baseline finding is that districts exposed to a greater World War I trade shock, which could be higher exports or lower imports or both, industrialized faster between 1911 and 1921. And this is robust to controlling for predetermined district characteristics and province fixed effect. We also check that the World War I trade shock does not predict the pre-trend, that we can instrument for it using British trade flows with other important trade partners of Britain, and that we obtain a similar result if we conduct a regression at the industry level. One concern that we had was that the World War I trade shock had an effect which persisted until 1921, not because the shock had a persistent effect on India, but because the fall in productivity in Britain, which was at the origin of the trade shock, perhaps persisted after World War I. To address this, we added to our baseline, and I have it here, a second shock constructed using the change in US imports from Britain between 1913 and 1921. Okay, so this is the change in the US imports from Britain between 1913 and 1921. We think this shock should capture some of those persistent drops in productivity in Britain, but once we include it, our results are still unchanged. So in terms of the magnitude, since the average shock is 0.11 pounds per person, this coefficient here implies that on average, the World War I trade shock increased the industrial employment share by 0.05 percentage point. This is a very small number, but you have to compare it with a tiny share of people working in industry. It was less than 1% in this period. Indeed, we find that the trade shock accounted for 29% of industrial employment growth in this period, so it was not negligible. So the World War I trade shock had a positive effect on Indian industry, which persisted until 1921, and we show later that it actually persisted for much longer. We think this is evidence in support of a dynamic model of trade and specialization, because in a static model, you might have expected the effect of a shock to disappear once the shock was over. And indeed, historians have noticed a persistent effect of World War I on Indian industry and have formulated 3 alternative hypotheses to explain this fact, which correspond to 3 alternative dynamic models of trade and specialization. The first is that industries that did well during the war learned to produce more efficiently or learned what they were good at producing. The second is that there was a boom psychology after the war associated with expectations of a more proactive industrial policy after World War I. It turned out that these expectations were largely unfulfilled, but that's a different matter. And finally, it has been argued that by creating exceptional profits, World War I alleviated the credit constraints faced by Indian entrepreneurs. So we tried to put together some, at least suggestive evidence to discriminate between these hypotheses. First, we separate the trade shock into its component parts, so imports versus exports, and then imports of primary products versus manufacturers, and then exports of primary product versus manufacturers. And we find that it is really manufacturing which drives the effect. Both a drop in imports and a boom in exports had a persistent effect. Although this result is not completely robust. In some specification, it disappears. We think this is consistent with the learning or industrial policy hypothesis, but perhaps less so with the credit constraints hypothesis, since a boom in exports of primary products must have also resulted in loosening of credit constraints, but there is no evidence that this led to more investment in industry. Next, we separate the increase in the industrial employment share into its components and find that the trade shock mostly added unskilled Indian workers, but it also added Indian managers and not British managers. And similarly here, when we replace our dependent variable with a change in the number of industrial firms, we find that the shock increased the total number of industrial firms, but mainly by increasing the number of personal Indian-owned firms as opposed to British-owned or companies or state-owned. So we think the message that comes out of this table is that the World War I trade shock made Indian industry more genuinely Indian. And we think this is consistent with the learning hypothesis, since presumably Indian managers and entrepreneurs have more to learn, but perhaps less so with the industrial policy hypothesis, since a more proactive industrial policy should have benefited firms independently of the nationality of their managers or owners. Finally, we replace our dependent variable with the number of accidents per workers and find that while accidents per workers initially increased more in districts more affected by the shock, they later decreased more, so that overall the industrial expansion was achieved with no increase in accidents per workers. And we think this may suggest that those unskilled workers that were added progressively learned how to operate the machines. So it is further evidence in support of the learning hypothesis. The last thing we do in this first part is to look at long-run effects. This coefficient here essentially reproduces our baseline. Then in this row, we replace the dependent variable with growth in subsequent periods, whereas here we look at cumulative effects. What emerges is that the shock moved affected districts with a higher level of industrialization, but did not affect growth afterwards. But the level effect remained visible throughout the period and to these days. Now, obviously, the longer the horizon, the higher the risk that there were subsequent shocks correlated with the World War I trade shock. So this period here was relatively quiet, but then here we had the Great Depression, here we had World War II, and here post-colonial protectionism. But the fact that we don't find any growth effect here seems to suggest that persistence, at least in colonial times, was maybe due to the persistent effect of World War I. For the post-colonial period, we do find a growth effect again, which suggests that this coefficient here should be taken with a pinch of salt. Okay, moving now to the second part of the paper. Our second hypothesis is that colonial trade, by favoring specialization, helped to keep the colonies subjugated by making them more economically dependent on the mother country. To test for that, we're going to study whether more industrialized districts, which are those who moved further away from the specialization induced by colonial trade, had stronger anti-imperial feelings. We begin in this table by asking whether districts more industrialized in 1921 had stronger anti-colonial feelings in our 1922 survey. where we instrument for industrialization levels using the World War I trade shock. We also control for our usual predetermined district level characteristics. For the main questions, are you in favor or not of immediate civil disobedience? We see that in more industrialized districts, INC members displayed stronger anti-colonial feelings. We also checked answers on specific forms of protest, although the size of the sample here gets much smaller. What we found, though, was that in more industrialized districts, INC members were more in favor of a boycott of British products, which is consistent with the view that anti-colonial feelings were driven by the interests of import-competing industries. Our second strategy is to study the impact of industrialization levels in 1936 on the share of seats won by the INC in the 1937 election, again instrumenting for industrialization levels using the World War I trade shock. And we find that more industrialized constituencies, apologies, I think I said districts, but here the unit of observation is a constituency. So more industrialized constituencies gave a higher share of votes to the INC, higher share of seats to the INC, and a lower share of seats to the main pro-British party. The coefficients in this table imply that the World War I trade shock increased the number of seats won by the INC by 8 seats out of 327, which they won. That is about 2.4%. This is a small number, but it is consistent with the little importance that industry had in the Indian economy. And these results in this table and in the previous one are consistent with the historical literature, which has argued that the industrialists supported Congress, especially by giving them campaign contributions. Finally, you may be worried that even after controlling for predetermined characteristics, perhaps the trade shock was correlated with deep-seated grievances against the British Empire. So what we did was to collect a district-level measure of participation to the Indian mutinies of 1857. This was the last big rebellion against Britain before 1920, and it's sometimes called the First Indian Independence War. We conduct a falsification exercise where we regress participation in the Indian mutinies directed on the export-import shock, finding nothing. This should alleviate the concern that the World War I trade shock might have been correlated with at least very deep-seated pre-existing grievances. Okay, so to conclude, our results are consistent with the view that colonial trade hindered industrialization in India and helped to keep it tied to the British Empire. We have shown that by showing that when colonial trade was temporarily interrupted for exogenous reasons, Indian industry flourished, and this industrial growth in turn strengthened support for the anti-colonial movement. Two caveats are in order. The first is that obviously our results do not show that the interruption in trade was welfare increasing for the usual reasons, but also because even this temporary interruption in trade contributed to the creation of a lobby of industrialists, which later in the history of the country contributed to the creation of a hyper-protectionist state, which, as we know, was detrimental for the Indian economy. And the second caveat is that it's unclear how generalizable to the average colony our results are, given that India was clearly better than average as a manufacturer. So with those caveats in mind, we can draw some implications. The first is that while modernizing for many colonies, colonial trade may have reduced long-run growth in others. Second, our results may help understand why the colonizers discouraged industrialization in the colonies. Of course, they may have feared competition against their own manufacturers, but they may also have feared political instability if the industrialists would become a powerful enough group in the colonies. And finally, our results may help explain why Britain was particularly successful as a colonizer. Being the first industrializers, it obtained extreme specialization within her empire, making it very costly for her colonies to rebel. Okay, I'm out of time, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roberto. You really were extremely efficient. You even finished a little earlier than your assigned time. I see Gianmarco wants to ask a question.
The question for Roberto is instead, so I mean, your results remind me of a paper by Reka Yuas at Columbia on the effects of the Napoleonic blockade on the development of the French textile industry.
Right.
So I don't know whether you know the paper. If you do, what we are learning more from your paper with respect to that paper?
So I think two things. First, our paper is on the colonial setting, and it directly addresses this criticism of colonial trade, in particular, that it was detrimental for long-run growth in the colonies. France, in Reka's paper, was an independent country that controlled the trade policy. India did not. India had to do what Britain decided, and Britain kept it open to international trade. And there's been an argument forever that that was very bad for the Indian economy, but no hard evidence to bear on that argument. And this paper tries to provide some. And the second is relative to Reka's paper. We also look at political implications, strength of anti-colonial feelings. And I think, obviously, there are other papers on trade shock and politics, but again, this is new in that we look at colonial setting and the determinant of decolonization, the breakup of empires, and we think we're first to do this. But we certainly learned a lot from that and other papers that preceded us.
Thank you, Roberto.
Roberto, you got a question from Marcus Zimmerman, who is asking you two questions. The first one, if you did also look at the industrial employment levels instead of just shares. And the second question is if you looked at the timing of the effects, okay? So the question is, when a shock hits, it maybe takes some years to build up the new industry, especially for a low-income country.
That's right. So let me answer the second question first. So remember, in this table here, I didn't comment on this regression, but here we decompose the trade shock into its two main parts, which are the shock to imports of manufactures and the shock to exports of primary products. So these were by far the most important trade flows for India. So one thing we did was, for those two shocks here, to decompose the war period into 4 sub-periods, so 13 to 15, 15 to 17, and so on. So what you see is that there was an immediate impact of the shock to exports of primary products. So booming districts increased their industrial employment share, but then that effect disappeared, and that's why when we look at the cumulative effect, we don't see anything. That's the result I already gave you. But when you look at manufactures, you find that indeed there was no immediate effect, but the effect built up. And the biggest part of it was in 1719, which is consistent with the historical literature, which has argued that the Indians already did well during the war, but they did what they could with the machinery they had. Then they really boomed only after the war was over, when they became able again to import machinery from Europe and from the US. So in that sense, you're perfectly right. In India too, as in developing countries more in general, the effect of the shock needed some time to become visible. And on the second question, whether we looked at levels as opposed to shares, I don't remember. I think we did in the very beginning, but I don't remember results. Those would be very different only if population changed a lot. I'm not aware of big population movements in this period, but I definitely don't know enough about that, so we'll check. Thank you.
Okay, Roberto, I don't see other questions. I will ask one question myself, profiting of my role as a chairman. I mean, what is interesting is the conclusion you derived. You said essentially this earlier push in industrialization didn't have long-term good welfare effects, because essentially generated a very protectionist, if you want, class of industrialists, that essentially, in fact, India was a very protected market after independence until the early 80s. The question is why this industrial class became so protectionist, in the sense that if you think, I mean, in a way, it was the British industrial in the early industrials in the mid 19th century who are really very much against the Corn Law, against protection, etc. And also essentially the if you take the case of Britain, the early transition to industry essentially reduced trade barriers. It was the first big push to real free trade. So why in India did this not happen?
Well, I think the answer was, so I've once heard I don't know if it's true, but I've heard the argument that Britain was the only country to industrialize without an industrial policy. I think this is somehow suggestive of an answer, in the sense that clearly India faced formidable competition from foreign industrializers, primarily Japan, but Britain too, and the US. So I don't think, despite whatever they may have learned during World War I, they clearly remained inefficient enough to fear foreign competition in the 20s and 30s. So when the post-colonial government was set in place, it was clearly an agreement between Congress and the industrialists that the new state would be interventionist. That's what the left of the INC wanted, and protectionist, and that's what the industrialists wanted. So in short, I don't think they felt strong enough to compete with the Japanese or other more efficient countries.